What if I told you that the deepest, most explosive betrayal inside the royal family didn't happen in front of flashing cameras or screaming headlines, but behind closed doors, in the shadows, and in the silence of a stolen file? What if the smiling photographs and carefully staged appearances we've all been shown were just a mask covering a secret war? A war in which one duchess would allegedly cross a line so unforgivable that it would land her on the wrong side of the law. Tonight, we aren't talking about whispers of jealousy or speculation about fashion choices. We are talking about criminal activity. We are talking about betrayal so profound that even the most private, classified medical details of Princess Kate and her children, and even the late Queen Elizabeth herself, may have been taken, leaked, and exploited. And the person accused of orchestrating this? None other than Meghan Markle. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let that sink in. This is no longer palace gossip. No longer vague accusations. This is evidence, legal filings, and a story that has shaken the monarchy to its very foundations. The woman who once stood hand in hand with Prince Harry as the symbol of modernizing the monarchy is now facing the possibility of being branded not just a royal rebel, but a criminal. And not just any criminal. A criminal accused of leaking classified royal files, targeting Kate, targeting Princess Charlotte, and crossing the line with documents about Queen Elizabeth herself. It sounds like the plot of a political thriller, but it is unfolding in real life. How did we get here? Let's rewind for a moment. From the very beginning, Kate Middleton represented stability, grace, a steady hand at William's side. She kept her head down, played her part, and carefully built her reputation as the unshakable backbone of the next generation of royals. Meghan, on the other hand, came in with the storm. A Hollywood actress turned duchess who promised change, who promised freshness, and who quickly clashed with everything the monarchy stood for. The tension between Kate and Meghan was obvious. But what if that tension wasn't just about style, personality, or even sibling rivalry? What if it was about something much darker? An invisible war for control, for influence, and for power. Now imagine being Kate, a woman who built her entire life on discretion, on protecting her family, on safeguarding the most intimate details of her children. And then one day, she discovers that those details, those private, confidential, classified medical files, have been accessed and leaked. Not just whispered about in gossip magazines, not just hinted at by sources close to the palace, but actually stolen and delivered into the hands of journalists across the Atlantic. Can you even begin to picture the sense of betrayal, the fury, the heartbreak? Because here's the shocking truth. In the world of the monarchy, privacy is power. Information is everything. Once your secrets are out there, once your weaknesses are revealed, you lose your leverage. And that's exactly what Kate faced when she learned that files concerning her health, Princess Charlotte's health, and even Queen Elizabeth's private medical history had been compromised. Files that, by law, should never leave palace walls. Files that, if leaked, could damage not only reputations but the very stability of the monarchy itself. Think about that. The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, abdications, divorces, and tragedies. But the idea that one of its own could betray it from the inside by stealing classified records? That's not just shocking, it's criminal. And that is exactly why Kate, normally so composed, so silent, so cautious, decided that this time she couldn't just smile for the cameras and carry on. This time, she had to fight back. Not with a carefully chosen outfit, not with a smile, but with lawyers, with evidence, with the law itself. And it didn't stop there. Because the moment those files crossed international borders, the case grew far bigger than a family dispute. This wasn't just Kate versus Meghan anymore. This was Britain versus America. This was the monarchy versus the media. This was a legal nightmare spiraling out of control, with the FBI and Interpol watching closely. Imagine the weight of that. An arrest warrant issued, international coordination underway, and the shocking moment Meghan Markle herself, the woman who once stood alongside the Queen, was suddenly in handcuffs. Arrested mid-transit. A scene that the world never imagined it would witness. But let's not jump ahead too far, because the road to that arrest is a twisted one. It involves secret meetings, digital footprints, journalists who thought they could hide, and royals who finally decided enough was enough. And at the center of it all, Kate, The woman who had been underestimated, dismissed as simply the dutiful wife, but who, when pushed to the edge, revealed a steel core no one saw coming. This wasn't just about her. This was about her daughter, about her grandmother-in-law, about defending the dignity of the monarchy itself. So let me ask you this. If your child's most private health details were stolen and leaked for the world to see, what would you do? Would you shrug it off? Would you let it go? Or would you fight, with everything you had, to protect them? Kate's answer was clear, and that clarity has turned into the most shocking royal legal battle of our time. And here's where the contradictions make this story even more fascinating. Meghan always presented herself as the victim of royal secrecy, as someone who wanted transparency, who wanted to speak the truth. And yet, now she's the one accused of violating privacy, of weaponizing secrets, of crossing boundaries that were never hers to cross. It's a story dripping with irony. The woman who claimed she was silenced is now accused of speaking too much. The woman who said she wanted freedom is now trapped in the consequences of her own actions. But remember, this is only the beginning. Because the deeper you look, the darker it gets. The files weren't random. They weren't meaningless. They were carefully chosen, deliberately leaked, and strategically placed to cause maximum damage. And as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Meghan may not have acted alone, that others may have had a hand in this betrayal, that this wasn't just an impulsive mistake, but a calculated plan. So what comes next? How did Meghan allegedly gain access to these records? Who helped her? Why was a U.S. journalist the chosen recipient? And what was Meghan's ultimate goal in leaking the files? These are the questions that investigators demanded answers to. These are the questions Kate's legal team used to build their case. And these are the questions that will take us deeper into this explosive story. But make no mistake, this isn't just a battle between two women. This is a battle over the very soul of the monarchy. A monarchy that has always survived by controlling its own narrative, by keeping its secrets locked away, by drawing an invisible line between the public and the private. And now, that line has been crossed in the most unforgivable way. And that's why this story matters right now. Because as we speak, the monarchy is in transition. King Charles is on the throne, William and Kate are preparing for their future roles, and the memory of Queen Elizabeth still casts a long shadow. Stability is everything. And in the middle of that fragile balance, Meghan's alleged actions have thrown gasoline on a fire that was already smoldering. So buckle up, because over the next chapters, we're going to peel back every layer of this scandal. We'll trace the leak from the moment it began to the moment Meghan was arrested. We'll reveal how Kate, once underestimated, became the driving force behind the legal action that has shaken the world. And we'll uncover the shocking truths that were buried in those stolen files. Because what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What if the storm that would one day tear apart the monarchy didn't begin with flashing cameras or international headlines, but with a silence so deafening it could only mean something was wrong? What if before the arrest, before the files, before the legal battle that would shake Buckingham Palace itself, there was an eerie calm, a silence in which Kate, instinctively, knew that something in her world was about to shatter? This is where our story truly begins. Not in a courtroom, not in the glare of the press, but in the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace, where suspicion took root and where the seeds of betrayal were sown. Kate had always trusted her instincts. Ask anyone who knows her, and they'll tell you she's a woman who doesn't act rashly, who doesn't leap before she looks. But she is also a mother, and a mother knows when something isn't right. You can cover it up with polished appearances, with rehearsed smiles, with carefully chosen words, but you cannot silence the gnawing voice of intuition. And Kate's intuition was screaming at her. It started small. A detail here, a whisper there. Something didn't add up. A headline in a foreign paper that seemed too specific. An offhand remark in a column that revealed knowledge no journalist should have had. Kate began to notice that the media suddenly had access to details that were supposed to be locked away, details that weren't meant to exist outside the palace walls. Ask yourself, how would you feel if information you thought was safe, private, and protected suddenly appeared in the public domain? Not broad, general gossip, not vague speculation, but intimate, specific details, things only someone on the inside could know. Would your blood run cold? Would your trust begin to crack? Kate felt both. At first, she thought it was coincidence. After all, the press has been circling the royal family for decades. Sometimes they stumble onto truth by accident. Sometimes a palace aide speaks out of turn. Sometimes speculation just happens to hit the mark. But this was different. This wasn't wild guesswork. These were facts. Cold, specific, undeniable facts that could only have come from one place: the classified records of the royal household. And yet, Kate stayed silent. That's what she did best. When Meghan and Harry exploded into interviews, Kate remained the picture of composure. When books and documentaries painted her as cold, distant, or calculating, she never said a word. She had been trained, conditioned even, to remain calm. But calm is not the same as blind. She saw, she listened, and deep down, she knew. So let's pause here and ask, who would have the motive? Who would dare? Who would cross a line so sacred that even the fiercest royal critics had never breached it? Who would dig into classified royal medical records? Whispers began circling about Meghan. It wasn't proof, not yet. But Kate noticed the pattern. Every time Meghan wanted to shift public attention, every time she needed sympathy, every time she wanted to highlight the supposed coldness of the palace, suddenly, a leak would appear. Information, conveniently framed, damaging Kate, elevating Meghan. Coincidence? Or a calculated strategy? Imagine Kate's position. The monarchy is not just a family. It's an institution. Every secret matters. Every piece of information can become a weapon. And when the leaks began, the quiet, calm before the storm became Kate's prison. She couldn't speak out. She couldn't confront Meghan without evidence. She couldn't even fully confide in William. Because to say the words aloud, that a member of their own family might be betraying them, was almost too horrific to contemplate. And yet, the cracks widened. One evening, Kate and William sat in their private residence, reading a foreign paper. There it was, a small detail about Kate's own health that no one outside the palace should ever have known. William froze. Kate went pale. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument they had ever endured. Because for the first time, William realized what Kate had been sensing for weeks. Something was very, very wrong. Still, they couldn't act. Not yet. Acting too soon would look paranoid. Acting without proof would risk everything. The palace thrives on discretion, not accusation. And so, Kate carried the burden in silence. But silence has a cost. You could see it in her eyes during public appearances. The smile was there, yes. The wave was there, yes. But behind the smile, behind the perfectly rehearsed expressions, there was tension. A mother's worry. A wife's fear. A princess's fury. And what about Meghan? She, on the other hand, seemed emboldened. She was distant from the palace, free across the ocean, playing her own game. While Kate tightened her lips and clenched her hands, Meghan was giving interviews, smiling on red carpets, and spinning her narrative of victimhood. She painted herself as the silenced one, the ignored one, the persecuted one. And yet, behind the scenes, Kate was starting to see her not as a victim, but as a predator. Ask yourself, was Meghan's silence about palace life truly silence? Or was it a mask, covering the fact that she had already spoken too much? Already crossed too many lines? Already reached into places she had no right to touch? Because here's where the contradictions twist the knife. Meghan said she was isolated, cut off, and silenced. But how could someone so silenced know so much? How could someone cut off from the palace still have access to classified files? It didn't make sense. Unless, of course, she had found a way. Unless, of course, she had help. Unless, of course, she had motives far beyond simply telling her truth. Kate's world was closing in. And that's when the calm before the storm became unbearable. Every appearance in public was a mask. Every conversation behind closed doors was guarded. Every glance exchanged with William carried the same question. What happens when this storm finally breaks? And break it would. Because Kate's silence couldn't last forever. The leaks grew bolder. The files got more specific. And soon, the breach would reveal itself in full force. But before the storm erupted, before the world would watch Meghan in handcuffs, before Kate's legal team would present their mountain of evidence, there was this moment. Kate, in her private chambers, staring down at a headline in disbelief. A headline that revealed details about Princess Charlotte, her daughter, a child. That was the moment when Kate knew the calm had ended. That was the moment when silence turned to rage. And that was the moment when Kate swore to herself, This was no longer about protocol or palace politics or even protecting the monarchy. This was about protecting her child. And nothing, not tradition, not silence, not even the crown itself, was going to stop her. Because what Kate discovered next about how those files were actually stolen would shock even her, and set into motion a chain of events that no one could control. And that's where we pick up next. What if I told you that the files weren't stolen in some cinematic midnight heist, but through something far more insidious, something that looked ordinary, routine, almost invisible? What if the breach that shattered Kate's trust and violated the royal family's most private details came not from a stranger hacking into palace systems, but from hands that already knew exactly where to look? Because that's the thing about betrayal. It rarely comes from the outside. The walls of Buckingham and Kensington Palace are fortified against the public. Surveillance cameras, guards, locked rooms, encryption. The biggest threats, the institution always believed, came from journalists lurking in the shadows or paparazzi with long lenses hiding in the bushes. But in reality, the danger was already inside. Kate's legal team later described it as the perfect betrayal. No forced entry, no alarms triggered, no physical break-in at all. Instead, the files were taken through access granted under the guise of trust, a password used when no one was watching, a database searched in the middle of the night, clicks on screens that left behind only faint digital shadows. Think about that for a moment. The royal family operates like a state. Every medical record is locked under the strictest confidentiality. The Queen's doctor, the Princess of Wales's private physician, even the pediatricians who attend to royal children, every one of them bound by oath and law. Those files are not gossip fodder. They are state secrets. And yet somehow, they ended up in Meghan Markle's orbit. How? Investigators pieced it together slowly. At first, no one wanted to believe it. The palace was adamant. Their systems were secure. But as the leaks continued, experts were brought in. Digital forensics, cyber specialists, professionals who could trace every keystroke, every login, every shadow on the palace's digital walls. And what they found was damning. Repeated unauthorized logins traced back to accounts connected with staffers who had, at one time or another, been in Meghan's circle. Suddenly, the pieces started to align. Meghan may not have physically hacked into anything herself, but she didn't need to. She had influence. She had access. And she had connections with people who could find a way in. Now, ask yourself, who would risk everything to cross Kate? Who would gamble their career, their loyalty, their future, to pass confidential files to Meghan? The answer may surprise you, because it wasn't one person, it was several. A quiet network of whispers, a chain of access. One aide slipped a password. Another, accidentally, left a folder open. A third, loyal more to Meghan than to the crown, looked the other way at a critical moment. But Meghan's fingerprints? They were all over the aftermath. Once the files were in her possession, the trail was unmistakable. Investigators uncovered emails, encrypted messages, subtle exchanges between Meghan and the journalist she allegedly trusted with the leaks. The timing was precise. Every new article that damaged Kate's reputation coincided with one of these secret communications. Picture this. Somewhere in Montecito, Meghan sitting at her sleek desk, a laptop open, her phone buzzing with encrypted updates. Across the ocean, a journalist preparing their next bombshell story, crafted with details that only an insider could provide. Meanwhile, Kate, halfway across the world, waking up to see headlines that revealed parts of her life she thought were locked away forever. Do you see the cruelty in that? The files weren't random. They weren't meaningless. They targeted Kate directly. Medical notes about her pregnancies, records about her hospital visits, information about Charlotte that no mother would ever want in the hands of strangers. Even files about Queen Elizabeth, details so closely guarded they were practically untouchable. And yet, here they were, out in the world. And Meghan, according to Kate's legal team, was the bridge that carried them from palace archives to American media. But here's the twist. Meghan didn't just sit back and leak everything at once. No, this was strategic, calculated. Each leak came at a moment of tension. A royal event where Meghan felt overshadowed, a story about Kate's popularity surging. Suddenly, another leak, another headline, another blow. Coincidence? Or orchestration? Kate saw the pattern, and the realization hit her like a thunderclap. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't some accidental slip of palace staff. This was warfare. Information warfare. And Meghan was playing to win. Now, let's be clear. Kate couldn't just storm into William's office and say, "It's Meghan." Without proof, it would have sounded paranoid. But once the investigation revealed the digital fingerprints, once the evidence pointed to Meghan's inner circle, the silence inside the palace broke. A quiet fury spread through those halls. Conversations behind closed doors grew colder, sharper. And Kate, who had waited in silence for years, now had what she needed. But here's the real kicker. The files weren't just damaging to Kate personally. They broke the law. The UK's Data Protection Act, GDPR regulations, confidentiality agreements, all violated. And when those files crossed borders into the US, the crime grew larger. International. Suddenly, this wasn't just Kate's problem. It wasn't even just Britain's problem. It was a transatlantic scandal. And that's why Kate's legal team pounced. They knew this wasn't about gossip anymore. This was about criminal conduct. They began building their case brick by brick, file by file, login by login. They documented every unauthorized access. They traced every connection back to Meghan's allies. They mapped every leak to a corresponding headline. Can you imagine the tension at that moment? Kate, usually silent, suddenly armed with evidence. Meghan, usually on the offensive, about to find herself cornered. The tables were turning. But let's not forget the human element here. Behind the evidence, behind the legal documents, was a woman, Kate, who had endured years of quiet attacks. And now she had proof that her worst suspicions were true. Imagine the emotions coursing through her. Anger, vindication, sadness, determination. And what about Meghan? Did she realize the trap was closing around her? Or did she think she was untouchable, untouchable across the Atlantic, untouchable in her Hollywood fortress? Did she laugh at the thought of Kate trying to take her down? Or did she sense, deep down, that the game was slipping from her control? One thing is certain. The breach of those files was the spark. The moment when whispers turned into evidence. When suspicion turned into certainty. When Kate transformed from the silent sufferer into the woman ready to strike back. But remember, this is only the beginning. Because the files weren't just stolen and leaked. They carried with them a secret so explosive, so shocking, that when it became clear what Meghan had chosen to expose, the monarchy would never be the same again. Because the next leak wasn't just about Kate. It wasn't even about Charlotte. It was about Queen Elizabeth herself. And that was the line Meghan should never, ever have crossed. And that's where we pick up next. What happens when a secret crosses an ocean? What happens when the walls of Buckingham Palace fail to contain the one thing they've protected for centuries? Information. And suddenly those secrets aren't whispered in the streets of London, but shouted across American tabloids and primetime television. This is where the story takes its sharpest turn. Because once the files left the UK, the scandal stopped being a royal problem. It became an international one. Let's paint the picture. For generations, the monarchy's greatest strength has been its ability to control the narrative. Silence, dignity, a refusal to explain or complain. That's how they've survived scandal after scandal. But what do you do when the very weapon you've relied on, privacy, is stripped from you and placed into the hands of a journalist across the Atlantic Ocean? That's the nightmare Kate found herself living. The leak to America was not random. It wasn't reckless. It was surgical, deliberate. Meghan knew exactly where to place those files. She didn't hand them to the British press, who would have been held accountable under UK privacy law. She didn't leak them to small gossip blogs that would burn out quickly. No, she went to a US journalist with the connections, the platform, and the reach to ensure the information not only spread, but spread like wildfire. Think about the brilliance and the cruelty in that decision. By moving the scandal across the Atlantic, Meghan created distance. Distance between her and the source. Distance between the palace and the law. Distance that made accountability harder, murkier, almost unreachable. At least, that's what she thought. The journalist, whose name would later surface during the investigation, was not some random reporter hungry for clicks. They were someone with influence. Someone with credibility. Someone whose word carried enough weight to bypass skepticism. When they printed details about Kate's health, readers didn't think rumor. They thought fact. And that's what made this leak so devastating. Kate's private medical records, once bound in the most secure archives of the monarchy, were now transformed into clickbait, into headlines, into content. And as if that wasn't enough, the leak didn't stop with her. Princess Charlotte's name appeared. A child's private medical notes. Can you imagine the horror of that? Imagine being Kate. Imagine seeing your daughter's most intimate details reduced to gossip for the world to consume. Would you ever forgive it? Could you? But here's where it gets even darker. Because the journalists didn't just report these details neutrally. They framed them, twisted them, presented them in a way that painted Kate as fragile, weak, and incapable of handling her royal role. It wasn't just a leak, it was a weapon. And Meghan's alleged fingerprints were all over that framing. Now ask yourself, why America? Why that specific journalist? The answer is simple: audience and protection. America was Meghan's home turf. It was where she and Harry had planted their flag, declaring independence from the monarchy. By using a U.S. journalist, Meghan not only ensured sympathetic coverage, but also placed herself beyond the immediate reach of UK law enforcement. Or so she believed. Because here's where the irony cuts deepest. The very thing Meghan thought would shield her, distance, was the thing that turned this from a palace dispute into an international incident. The moment those files left the UK, they became evidence of a cross-border crime. A violation not just of trust, not just of morality, but of law. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the fury was boiling. Kate's legal team documented everything. Every article, every timestamp, every email chain uncovered by digital forensics. They mapped the flow of information from palace servers to Meghan's circle to the journalist's inbox. The pattern was undeniable. And the more undeniable it became, the more determined Kate grew. But Meghan? She wasn't panicking. Not yet. From her perspective, the leaks were working. Her narrative was gaining traction. She was shaping public opinion. For every headline that cast Kate as fragile, Meghan positioned herself as strong. For every story about Kate's health, Meghan's allies whispered about her own suffering. It was a mirror game. One woman diminished, the other elevated. And yet, there's a dangerous arrogance in thinking you're untouchable. Meghan may have believed distance protected her. But the law doesn't stop at the ocean. Privacy laws, data protection agreements, and international treaties gave Kate's team the leverage they needed. What Meghan thought was her shield would soon become her undoing. But before we get there, let's not skip over the most shocking part of this leak. It wasn't just about Kate. It wasn't just about Charlotte. It wasn't even about the monarchy's image. The leak contained files so sensitive, so closely guarded, that when their existence in the journalist's possession was confirmed, even the investigators were stunned. Files belonging to Queen Elizabeth II. Think about that. The Queen, an icon of privacy, tradition, and dignity, violated in her final years. Her medical details, stolen and shipped overseas, reduced to material for a journalist's scoop. That was the line. That was the point of no return. If Kate had ever hesitated, if she had ever wondered whether she was doing the right thing by pursuing Meghan legally, that moment erased all doubt. But let me ask you this. Do you think Meghan knew what she was unleashing by including the Queen's files? Or do you think she underestimated the fallout, believing she could wield them as leverage without igniting global outrage? Was it strategy? Or was it hubris? What we do know is this. Once Queen Elizabeth's name surfaced in those leaks, the monarchy was united in a way it hadn't been for years. William, Charles, Anne, even courtiers who had remained neutral. Suddenly, this wasn't just Kate's battle. This was the royal family defending the dignity of their matriarch. And that unity gave Kate the full weight of the crown behind her. The leak to America, intended to weaken Kate and destabilize the monarchy, backfired spectacularly. It turned a feud into a war. It turned suspicion into certainty. And it turned Meghan from a rogue duchess into a potential criminal under investigation. The journalist who received the files wasn't just a messenger. They were also a liability. And when investigators closed in, that journalist faced a choice: protect Meghan or protect themselves. And their decision would change everything. What if I told you that the one name Meghan should never have touched was the one she went after anyway? What if, in her quest to control the narrative, she made the most catastrophic mistake of all, dragging Queen Elizabeth II into the storm? Because let's be honest, Kate's private files were shocking enough. Charlotte's inclusion was unforgivable. But when the leaks revealed confidential records belonging to the late Queen, the monarchy moved from outrage to war. This wasn't just a breach of privacy anymore. It was sacrilege. The Queen's medical history had always been shrouded in the deepest secrecy. Even in her later years, when the public speculated endlessly about her health, Buckingham Palace maintained a strict wall of silence. At most, carefully worded statements would be issued. The Queen is resting. The Queen is under medical supervision. Never details. Never specifics. To protect her dignity. To protect the monarchy. Because the Queen wasn't just a woman. She was the institution itself. And then suddenly, there it was. Details never meant to be public. Notes about hospital stays. Records of treatments. The kind of sensitive information that, in the wrong hands, could be twisted into scandal. These weren't the vague statements the palace issued. These were classified documents, meant only for a handful of trusted doctors and staff. And now they were in the possession of an American journalist, courtesy of Meghan Markle. Stop for a moment and think about the enormity of that. Queen Elizabeth, who carried the crown for 70 years, who lived her life by the code of silence and service, reduced to a headline. Her medical vulnerabilities, things she fought to keep private, not just exposed, but exploited. Can you imagine how that hit the royal family? For Charles, her son, now king, it was personal. For William and Kate, it was a violation of their grandmother's dignity. For the courtiers, it was a breach of tradition that shook them to their core. And for Kate, it was the final straw. Up until that point, this had been her battle. Her privacy, her daughter's security. But once Elizabeth's files were dragged into it, Kate knew this was bigger than her, bigger than Meghan. This was about the monarchy itself. And in that moment, Kate's fury transformed into resolve. Meghan had crossed a line she could never uncross. But here's the chilling twist. Meghan didn't just leak the Queen's files accidentally. According to investigators, it was deliberate. The Queen's inclusion wasn't random, it was strategic. By leaking the monarch's most sacred secrets, Meghan thought she could shake the monarchy's credibility, show the world that even the crown wasn't invincible, that no secret was safe, that the palace could be cracked open like any other institution. Do you see the irony? Meghan believed she was weakening the monarchy. Instead, she strengthened it. The Queen's inclusion in the leaks united the family. Where once there had been divisions, between Charles, between William and Harry, between and Andrew, suddenly, they were all on the same side. United not by choice, but by outrage. And yet, the damage was done. Across the Atlantic, American audiences devoured the revelations. News anchors discussed Elizabeth's health as if it were common knowledge. Commentators speculated about her treatments, her strength, her decline. For a woman who had built her reign on mystery and restraint, it was the ultimate humiliation. Ask yourself, how would you feel if your grandmother's most private medical history was plastered across international headlines? Would you stand by quietly? Would you shrug it off? Or would you rise, with every ounce of strength you had, to protect her dignity? Kate chose the latter. And in doing so, she positioned herself as the avenger not just of her own family, but of the monarchy itself. Meanwhile, Meghan underestimated the backlash. In her circle, the leaks were spun as transparency, a chance to show the monarchy's supposed hypocrisy. But to the public, especially in the UK, it was a betrayal too far. The Queen was untouchable, beloved, sacred, and Meghan had just committed the unthinkable. She had violated her. The journalist, too, felt the heat. Publishing Kate's details had been risky enough. But Elizabeth? That was a career-ending move if the law caught up with them. And behind closed doors, investigators were circling. Emails, bank transfers, encrypted messages. The trail was tightening, and the journalist knew it. And here's where paranoia set in. Meghan, according to palace insiders, began reaching out frantically, checking who had copies of the files, asking whether backups had been made, fearful that evidence would resurface in ways she couldn't control. That panic revealed something crucial. Meghan knew she had crossed a line. She knew Elizabeth's files weren't just damaging, they were damning. But here's the kicker. Those files contained more than medical notes. They included confidential correspondence between physicians and palace officials, conversations about succession, hints about the Queen's concerns in her final years, information that, if twisted, could destabilize Charles's early reign. And Meghan had handed it all to a journalist. Kate's legal team seized on that. They didn't just frame the leak as a privacy violation. They framed it as a national security threat. Because when the Queen's health and the stability of the crown are dragged into the spotlight, the ripple effects go far beyond gossip. They touch the very fabric of Britain's governance. And that's why international authorities stepped in. The FBI, Interpol. Suddenly, Meghan wasn't just facing Kate's wrath, she was facing global scrutiny. What started as whispers about betrayal was now a matter of law enforcement across borders. But let me ask you this, was Meghan naive enough to think she could get away with it? Or was she arrogant enough to believe she couldn't be touched? Did she really believe her celebrity shielded her from the consequences of crossing the Queen? Because while Meghan believed she was playing chess, Kate had already switched to war. The moment the Queen's files were revealed, Kate moved into action. Lawyers, evidence, international cooperation. This was no longer about rumor. This was about justice. And that's where the story turns once again. Because if the Queen's inclusion united the royal family against Meghan, the next revelation, the inclusion of Princess Charlotte, would ignite something far deeper. Something primal. A mother's rage that no law, no distance, and no crown could contain. And that's where we go next. What would you do if your child's most intimate secrets were stolen, passed around like gossip, and printed for strangers to consume? What would you do if your daughter, just a little girl, innocent, protected from the world, became collateral damage in a war she never chose? Because that's what happened to Kate. And make no mistake, this was the breaking point. Up until now, the leaks had been horrifying. Kate's private medical notes were bad enough. Queen Elizabeth's sacred dignity being violated was an unthinkable outrage. But when Princess Charlotte's name surfaced, when her medical files, a child's files, appeared in those stolen documents, the calm, composed Princess of Wales snapped. Let's stop here for a moment and think about what that means. Charlotte isn't a public figure in the way her parents are. She's a child, protected by law, protected by morality, protected by a mother who would do anything to shield her from the ugliness of the world. And yet, in the cold, calculating strategy of Meghan Markle, even Charlotte became a weapon. The files were specific. They weren't vague mentions. They included details no journalist should ever have known. Hospital visits, doctor's notes, private information that only palace physicians and a few staff members could possibly have seen. To see them laid bare in the hands of a foreign journalist was like a dagger to Kate's heart. Now, imagine this moment. Kate, sitting at her desk in Kensington Palace. The article open in front of her. Charlotte's name in print. Words that should never have left the palace archives now blaring across an American platform. A mother's fury is unlike anything else. And in that moment, Kate's fury ignited. She had endured silence. She had endured restraint. She had endured the humiliation of seeing her own records twisted and leaked. But Charlotte? No, this was unforgivable. This was war. And the irony? Meghan had always claimed she wanted to protect her own children from royal intrusion. She had made speeches about privacy, about shielding Archie and Lilibet from the glare of public life. Yet here she was, accused of violating that same principle when it came to Kate's daughter. Hypocrisy doesn't even begin to cover it. Ask yourself, how would you react if the person preaching privacy for their children turned around and exploited yours? Would you stay quiet? Would you forgive? Or would you fight with every ounce of strength in your body? Kate chose the last option. Investigators later revealed that Charlotte's files were not leaked accidentally. They were targeted, included deliberately to cause maximum damage. Why? Because Meghan allegedly knew the emotional weight it would carry. Exposing Kate was one thing. But exposing her daughter? That would destabilize her, break her composure, push her to the edge. But Meghan underestimated Kate. She didn't break. She hardened. The palace atmosphere changed overnight. William, usually the steady diplomat, erupted in private. Charlotte was his little girl. The thought of her medical history being treated like cheap gossip sent him into a fury few had ever seen. Courtiers described him as white-hot with rage. And for the first time, William and Kate were not just victims, they were warriors, determined to fight back, together. And the timing of this leak could not have been more explosive. The world was still adjusting to Queen Elizabeth's passing. Charles had just begun his reign. The monarchy was fragile. To drag Charlotte into the spotlight at that moment was like striking a match in a room soaked with gasoline. The press in Britain reacted with outrage. Even tabloids that had criticized Kate in the past closed ranks. Headlines screamed about the violation of a child's privacy. Public sympathy swung firmly to Kate's side. Ordinary parents, mothers and fathers across the country, looked at her and thought, that could have been my child. Meghan had overplayed her hand. And here's the thing. Kate knew how to weaponize silence. She didn't rant. She didn't give interviews. She didn't stage a dramatic outburst. Instead, she let the outrage grow on its own. Her silence became her weapon. The public filled in the gaps with their own fury. And behind the scenes, Kate and her legal team tightened the noose. But Meghan? She miscalculated. Instead of backing down, she doubled down. Her allies in the media tried to spin it. They suggested the leaks weren't her doing. They claimed the information was already circulating. They even tried to paint Kate as overreacting. But the damage was done. Once Charlotte's name appeared, there was no going back. And here's where the law comes crashing down. Under UK regulations, a child's privacy is sacred. Under international law, it's even stricter. By leaking Charlotte's files, Meghan hadn't just crossed an ethical line. She had committed a legal offense with serious consequences. This was no longer a matter of palace politics. It was a matter for the courts. Kate's legal team pounced. They compiled evidence with surgical precision. Every unauthorized login, every file accessed, every digital trail that led from palace servers to Meghan's circle and ultimately to the journalist. And at the center of their case, the fact that Charlotte's records had been exposed. That alone was enough to guarantee international cooperation. Now, picture Meghan during this moment. Did she realize how deep she was in? Or did she still believe she was untouchable, protected by her Hollywood image and her distance from the crown? Did she even understand that by targeting Charlotte, she had turned not just Kate, but the entire British public against her? Because here's the truth. Once Charlotte's files were leaked, there was no longer any sympathy left. The public who once admired Meghan's courage now saw something darker. Vindictiveness, cruelty, hypocrisy. She had become the villain of her own story. And Kate? She had become something far more powerful than the silent, dutiful wife. She had become the mother who would do anything to protect her children. And that role resonated. It gave her moral authority Meghan could never touch. Because while Kate was building her legal arsenal, while public outrage was mounting, and while Meghan still believed she could spin the narrative, investigators uncovered something that shocked even them. The leak of Charlotte's files wasn't the end of the trail, it was the beginning. The files contained hidden metadata, digital fingerprints that revealed not only who accessed them, but how. And when experts traced those fingerprints back, they didn't just find palace staff. They found a direct link, straight to Meghan herself. And that revelation would change everything. What happens when a woman who has been silent for years finally decides to fight? What happens when the calm, dutiful Princess of Wales transforms into a strategist, a warrior, and a woman determined to take down the very person who tried to destroy her family? That's exactly what unfolded once Princess Charlotte's files were leaked. Because from that moment on, Kate wasn't just a victim. She was an avenger. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was done. Kate had always been cautious, measured. She never made rash moves, never reacted impulsively to the chaos swirling around the royal family. But this time was different. Meghan had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. This wasn't about palace politics anymore. This wasn't about who wore which dress or who sat where at a ceremony. This was about the safety of her child. And Kate's instincts, sharpened by years of scrutiny, kicked into high gear. She knew she couldn't scream. She couldn't lash out in public. That would only feed Meghan's narrative. Instead, she had to play Meghan's least favorite game: patience, precision, the law. And so the legal strategy began. Picture Kate at Kensington Palace, not in ball gowns or tiaras, but seated with her team of advisors and lawyers. Papers spread across the table, screens glowing with evidence. William at her side, furious but steady. Every detail mattered. Every timestamp, every login, every email. This wasn't about telling the world Meghan had betrayed them. It was about proving it beyond a shadow of a doubt. Her legal team knew the stakes. They weren't just dealing with a family squabble. They were dealing with a crime that spanned borders. The UK's Data Protection Act had been violated. GDPR regulations were breached. Children's privacy laws were shattered. And when the files crossed into the United States, US privacy laws came into play as well. This wasn't just a case for the palace. It was a case for international courts. Kate's team carefully mapped out a three-pronged strategy. First, they would establish the breach, prove that classified files had been accessed illegally. Second, they would trace the flow of those files, step by step, from palace servers to Meghan's inner circle. And third, they would expose the intent, that this wasn't some accident or oversight, but a deliberate, malicious act designed to harm Kate, her daughter, and even Queen Elizabeth. And here's where things get fascinating. For years, Meghan had been able to play the narrative game. She painted herself as the victim. She framed Kate as cold, unfeeling, unwelcoming. But legal cases don't care about feelings. They care about evidence, paper trails, forensic proof. And for the first time, Meghan was in an arena she couldn't control with charm, interviews, or tears. Kate's lawyers worked like detectives. They brought in cybersecurity experts who traced every unauthorized login. They brought in digital forensic specialists who tracked the metadata hidden inside the leaked files. They even consulted with international law enforcement agencies, quietly laying the groundwork for what was to come. And the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. Meghan wasn't just adjacent to the leak. She was at the center of it. Ask yourself, what would it feel like to finally hold the smoking gun after years of silent suspicion? To finally know, beyond doubt, that the person who had tormented you through whispers and headlines was guilty of something so much worse? For Kate, it was bittersweet. There was anger, yes. Vindication, absolutely. But there was also sadness. Because this wasn't just about her versus Meghan. This was about a family being torn apart, a monarchy being destabilized. But Kate had no choice. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her daughter, for her grandmother-in-law's dignity, for the future of the crown. Her team decided on a bold move. They would file in both the UK and the US. They would make this an international case, impossible for Meghan to escape by hiding behind borders. And they would leak nothing to the press. Not yet. Because while Meghan fought her battles in headlines, Kate would fight hers in courtrooms. Quiet, methodical, lethal. The irony is sharp, isn't it? Meghan, who always accused the palace of silencing her, now found herself facing silence used as a weapon. Kate didn't need to speak. She didn't need to give interviews. She didn't need to explain herself. The evidence was speaking louder than she ever could. Meanwhile, Meghan's camp grew nervous. Her allies in the press began to shift their tone. Some grew quieter. Others distanced themselves because they could see what was coming. And when the legal machine of the monarchy begins to move, it doesn't stop. And here's where the contradictions made it even more powerful. Meghan had claimed she was fighting for transparency, that she was exposing truths. But now, those very claims were being used against her. If she was truly for privacy, why leak Charlotte's files? If she cared about dignity, why expose Elizabeth's? The legal strategy wasn't just about evidence. It was about exposing Meghan's hypocrisy, point by point, until her credibility crumbled. But let's not underestimate Meghan. She wasn't about to go down quietly. Even as Kate's legal team tightened the noose, Meghan prepared her own defense. She claimed she was being targeted. She framed herself as a victim of revenge. And behind the scenes, she sought to gather allies who could testify on her behalf. But Kate's lawyers were ready for that too. They built a wall of evidence so strong, so unbreakable, that no narrative spin could touch it. Emails, metadata, encrypted messages decrypted. Witnesses who had once been loyal to Meghan, now turning to save themselves. It was a web, and Meghan was caught in the middle. And here's the emotional core of it. Kate didn't want to do this. She had been forced. For years, she had chosen silence. For years, she had endured humiliation, criticism, attacks. But once her daughter was targeted, she had no choice. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a mother on the warpath. And when a mother fights for her child, she becomes unstoppable. So the legal strategy wasn't just about law. It was about sending a message. To Meghan. To the world. To anyone who thought the monarchy was fragile. The message was clear. You can gossip. You can speculate. But if you cross into crime, if you touch a child, you will face the full weight of the crown. But here's the twist. Just as Kate's legal team prepared to file their case, investigators uncovered something even more shocking. The files didn't just reveal private details. They contained notes, hidden in the metadata, that suggested Meghan had deliberately timed the leaks to coincide with royal events. Coronations, state visits, key moments when Kate was most visible. In other words, this wasn't just a betrayal. It was a campaign, a calculated plan to destabilize Kate and, by extension, the monarchy. And with that revelation, the legal strategy shifted from strong to unstoppable, because proving intent turned this from a privacy breach into something far more serious, something criminal, something prosecutable across borders. And that's where the next chapter begins. Because once the evidence was in place, once the strategy was ready, the next move was inevitable. Meghan would be confronted with the proof, and the world would see the undeniable evidence that placed her at the center of it all. But what Kate's team didn't know was that the evidence wouldn't just expose Meghan's role. It would uncover allies, people inside and outside the palace who had helped her, people no one expected. And that revelation would take the case from shocking to earth-shattering. And that's where we go next. What if the whispers of betrayal you'd suspected for years suddenly crystallized into hard, undeniable proof? What if all the rumors, all the suspicions, all the sleepless nights staring at headlines finally led to a stack of evidence so damning that even the most loyal allies could no longer deny it? That was the turning point for Kate. The moment when doubt ended and certainty began. The moment when Meghan's actions were no longer just gossip. They were documented crimes. Chapter 7 begins with the unveiling of the evidence. And it is not subtle. It is explosive. The forensic trail was meticulous. Every digital step Meghan and her alleged collaborators took left behind a shadow. Tiny fragments that the untrained eye might miss, but which expert investigators saw clearly. Unauthorized logins traced back to devices linked to Meghan's trusted circle. Copies of files accessed at odd hours. Metadata embedded deep within the documents, showing when they had been opened, altered, and shared. These weren't guesses. These weren't coincidences. They were cold, technical facts. Imagine the scene. A dimly lit room where Kate's legal team presented their findings. Lawyers flipping through thick binders, forensic specialists pointing to screens filled with timelines and graphs. At the head of the table sat Kate, silent but watchful. William beside her, his jaw clenched. Every revelation was another nail in the coffin. The first nail, access logs. Investigators showed that palace medical records had been entered using credentials belonging to staffers long gone from royal employment. People who, it turned out, had close ties to Meghan after her departure from Britain. Passwords that should have been deactivated had been exploited. Access that should have been impossible was suddenly routine. The second nail, correspondence. Encrypted emails and message logs recovered from servers painted a damning picture. Meghan in communication with the U.S. journalist at suspicious intervals. Dates lining up precisely with each new article that appeared. The messages weren't always explicit, coded language, vague references, subtle hints. But when matched with the timing of leaks, the pattern was undeniable. The third nail, money. Bank records showed payments, carefully hidden but traceable, flowing from media companies into accounts linked with Meghan's network. Payments that coincided with the leaks. Payments that could not be explained away as coincidence. And then, the hammer blow. A file recovered from the journalist's computer contained the original versions of Kate's and Charlotte's records. Versions with digital fingerprints identifying the exact palace system they had come from. And embedded within the metadata of one file was something no one expected. Meghan's own digital signature. A trace from her personal device, left behind like an incriminating fingerprint. Stop and think about that for a moment. For all her planning, for all her secrecy, Meghan left her mark. Perhaps it was arrogance. Perhaps it was carelessness. But that single trace tied her directly to the files. There was no longer plausible deniability. No longer the possibility of blaming rogue aides or overzealous journalists. The evidence placed her at the center. But it didn't stop there. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered Meghan hadn't acted alone. Several names surfaced, some shocking, some expected. A palace staffer who had quietly sided with her during the Sussex's exit. A foreign tech consultant who provided the tools for encryption. Even whispers of allies in Hollywood who helped her shape how and when the leaks would hit the media. This wasn't a single act of betrayal. It was a coordinated campaign. Now, imagine Kate's reaction. For years, she had been painted as paranoid, cold, unfeeling. But here, at last, was the vindication. The proof she wasn't imagining it. The evidence that the person who had tormented her through innuendo and headlines was guilty of something far darker. It wasn't joy she felt. It wasn't triumph. It was fury. Cold, clear fury. And William? He had always been cautious, careful about escalation. But when confronted with the evidence, witnesses say he slammed his hand on the table. "This ends now," he declared. It was no longer a question of if they would act, but how hard they would strike. But here's the contradiction that makes this story so gripping. Meghan had always claimed she wanted to reveal the truth, to shine a light on palace secrecy. And yet, the evidence showed she was the one twisting truth into weapons, exploiting secrets for her own gain. She had become the very thing she accused others of being: a manipulator, a deceiver, a violator of privacy. Kate's legal team knew the case was airtight, but they also knew the battle ahead would be brutal. Meghan would fight tooth and nail. She would deny. She would spin. She would paint herself as the victim, as she had done so many times before. But this time, Kate had something Meghan couldn't fight with interviews or public sympathy: proof. The strategy was simple: build a mountain of evidence so unshakable that even Meghan's allies in the media would hesitate to defend her. Every login, every payment, every email, piece by piece, brick by brick, until the weight of it was crushing. And while Kate prepared for war, Meghan still believed she had the upper hand. Her circle told her the palace would never risk the public fallout of dragging her into court. That Kate, ever the silent one, would back down before it came to trial. That the monarchy would protect itself by avoiding exposure. Meghan underestimated Kate again, because Kate had reached the point of no return. For her, this wasn't about fear of headlines. It wasn't about optics. It was about justice for her daughter, about restoring dignity to her grandmother-in-law, about sending a message to Meghan and to the world: some lines cannot be crossed. And here's the twist: the evidence didn't just expose Meghan. It exposed how fragile the palace's own systems had been. The monarchy prided itself on secrecy, on strength, on unshakable walls. But those walls had cracks. Cracks Meghan had exploited. And now, Kate had no choice but to patch them in the most public way possible, through legal action. But what happens when that evidence leaves the safety of private rooms and enters the courtroom? What happens when Meghan, cornered, is forced to face the weight of proof that ties her directly to the crime? Does she deny? Does she break down? Does she fight until the end? The stage was set. The evidence was in place. And Kate's team was ready to strike. But the moment that evidence left their hands and entered the world's spotlight, the scandal exploded beyond anything they could have imagined. Because Meghan wasn't the only one under investigation anymore. The evidence pointed to something bigger: an international conspiracy involving more players than anyone expected. And that revelation would take this from a royal feud into a global scandal. What happens when a scandal crosses borders? When private, classified files stolen from one of the world's most protected families land on foreign soil, the implications aren't just personal, they're global. This is where the story takes a turn from a royal feud into an international crisis. By the time investigators traced Meghan's digital fingerprints, the files had already reached the United States. U.S. media outlets were running stories, printing details of Kate's private medical records, Princess Charlotte's files, and the late Queen Elizabeth's confidential information. Across screens and front pages, millions were absorbing information that should never have existed outside palace walls. And that's when the legal firestorm began to burn beyond the UK. The moment the leaks crossed an international border, the crime escalated. Suddenly, UK authorities weren't the only ones involved. International law enforcement agencies were pulled into the investigation. Interpol, the FBI, and even specialized cybercrime units tasked with tracking digital thefts of sensitive data. The privacy breach that started in the quiet halls of Kensington Palace became a cross-border legal nightmare. Imagine it: agents poring over server logs, emails, and encrypted messages. Lines of code tracing the flow of confidential information. Experts analyzing timestamps, geolocations, and metadata. The stakes had skyrocketed. What was once a personal betrayal had become a case of international law enforcement interest. And every day the files remained in the U.S., the potential for legal repercussions grew. For Kate and her legal team, this presented both opportunity and urgency. Opportunity, Because international jurisdiction gave them leverage that Meghan hadn't anticipated. Urgency, because every moment those files remained exposed increased the risk of further leaks or obfuscation. Kate's team knew they had to act fast to secure the evidence, protect her family, and set the stage for prosecution. And while this was happening, Meghan seemed oblivious to the storm gathering around her. She continued her public appearances, media interviews, and social engagements, projecting calm and confidence. But behind the scenes, whispers circulated in her circle, concerns about evidence, about investigators closing in, about the possibility of international arrest warrants. Here's where the tension becomes palpable. Imagine the headlines. Royal scandal goes global. Duchess accused of international privacy breach. Queen's private records exposed in U.S. The story was no longer just about Meghan and Kate. It was about the monarchy, international law, and the integrity of privacy protections across countries. For William and Kate, the implications were staggering. This wasn't simply a matter of defending their family's dignity. It was about demonstrating that the monarchy, and by extension Britain, would not allow its most private secrets to be exploited internationally. Kate's resolve hardened. She wasn't just fighting for herself or her daughter anymore. She was defending the principle that the Crown and its members could not be manipulated with impunity. Meanwhile, Meghan's team scrambled to respond. They consulted lawyers in both the UK and the US, attempting to assess the legal landscape. They tried to spin the narrative in the media that Meghan was being targeted unfairly, that she had acted with good intentions, that the leaks were somehow not her fault. But no amount of narrative control could hide the digital trail left behind. Emails, metadata, access logs, all pointing back to her. And here's the critical turning point. The international angle allowed Kate's legal team to push for an arrest warrant. Not just in the UK, but globally. Interpol issued an alert. Travel restrictions were discussed. The moment Meghan attempted to cross borders, she risked immediate detention. Can you imagine the tension? Meghan traveling, perhaps thinking she was untouchable, only to be confronted with the stark reality that international law enforcement was now involved. Every flight, every border crossing, every step potentially fraught with danger. The palace's silent fury had escalated into international action. And yet, for all the legal firepower, there was still strategy involved. Kate didn't want Meghan humiliated publicly before the case was airtight. The palace and her legal team moved cautiously, quietly coordinating across agencies to ensure that when the moment of confrontation arrived, it would be decisive. The irony was bitter. Meghan had always portrayed herself as the champion of transparency and victimhood. Yet she was now caught in a web of law she could neither spin nor escape. Her celebrity, her distance, her charm, all of it meant nothing in the face of documented evidence, international jurisdiction, and the relentless drive of a mother protecting her family. Public reaction was also unprecedented. Audiences on both sides of the Atlantic followed the story, shocked at the implications. Social media exploded. Commentators debated legal responsibility versus ethical responsibility. Royals were dissected. Opinions divided. But one thing was undeniable. The monarchy, led by Kate's unflinching legal resolve, had turned a personal attack into an international scandal with real consequences. And here's where the suspense intensifies. Just as the international pressure was mounting, Meghan made a move. She attempted to preempt legal action by releasing statements, appealing to sympathetic journalists, and leveraging celebrity influence to create a narrative of persecution. But with international law enforcement closing in, her options were rapidly shrinking. The stage was set for confrontation. International warrants, evidence that could not be ignored. And Meghan, unaware of just how tightly the net was closing, prepared to move, only to walk straight into the storm. And that's where we pick up next. Because the moment of reckoning, Meghan's arrest, was approaching.